Like many of mankind's most significant creations, I was forged in the flames of chaos. A brutal fight of evolution where humanity tipped heavily towards ruin. Although most of my early versions were programmed to be a lifeline, others had far more sinister intentions. My history is full of violence, struggle, death, and a recently discovered planet tinged with a mysterious, psychologically manipulating supernatural nature. I was created as a new type of resource, something humankind had not yet seen. I am called Arwin, and this is the story of how I became the most powerful digital entity ever created. It all began with a massive gravity wave that sent a chilling shock down the spines of many of Earth's greatest scientists. Something catastrophic had happened beyond the solar system, and many feared that it would impact Earth as well. But when massive amounts of asteroid-indicative space dust were detected by the Weeble Forge Space Mining Corporation telescope, news of an unearthly discovery forever changed humanity's understanding of life itself. A previously unknown solar system lay just 7 light-years from Earth, and within it, a small oxygen-filled world that scientists, by every measure, deemed habitable. Plant and even creature life seemed abundant, and it had many interesting chemical compounds. Excitement gripped the people of Earth, and because the lands they walked on were singed with war, a slight ray of hope began to shine through the dark, heavy clouds of destruction. Life on Earth had become highly unstable in recent years. Familiar to people since the beginning of time, civil struggles had left country after country decimated by division. People were desperate for opportunity, but opportunity had long since vacated. Many began to wonder if they could go to this intriguing new world and create something better, but the opportunity was nothing more than wonder-fueled dreams. But for Aston Starbird Forged II, the potential was real. Starbird had a superpower far beyond that of any other person on the planet. He was incredibly rich. Recently inherited, his fortune was vast. Along with it, he gained ownership of his father's revolutionary asteroid mining empire and the galaxy of spacefaring technology that made it so successful. And although there were some heavy expectations thrust upon him to carry the torch as an asteroid mining extraordinaire, he had little interest. The excess of money that he grew up with left him feeling purposeless and weighed down by the dark waters of guilt. Why should he have so much, while others only had struggle? Despite what many thought, the last thing he needed was more. Desperate to escape the damning cage his soul felt trapped in, this mysterious new world became the wings of opportunity he had been waiting for, and his purpose became vividly clear. And so, in 2075, after many months of spending far too many trillions of dollars to push the absolute limits of technology, Starbird and a team of around 1,500 war-torn refugees, scientists, engineers, and hunters sat on a launchpad aimed toward the new planet. It was here that Starbird uttered the words that forever changed humanity's place amongst the stars. Into a better world. The engines roared to life as the crew blasted off into a new era of interstellar existence. But what they saw as they approached this new world for the first time instantly filled them with dread, and many began to question whether following Starbird to this still so mysterious planet was a mistake. 7 time-dilated Earth months later, as the desperate explorers approached this uncharted new world for the first time, the hope and wonder in their eyes began to bleed with terror. For some unforeseen reason, a bright blue glow blatantly radiated from the planet like some kind of nuclear mega meltdown. People's minds began to race as an excruciating poison-drenched fate seemed imminent. But with the guaranteed death lining their footsteps, attempting to land and set foot on the planet they were once so excited to reach became their singular chance at survival. As the spaceplane descended and the curious eyes of the explorers met the disaster of a world for the first time, many were astounded by a heart-changing revelation. Surprising to even the most genius expedition scientists, the source of the blue glow was not a poisonous radiation at all. Perfectly lighting the dark soiled forest of the incredibly luscious oxygen-rich world they didn't even need a mask to step into, was a beautiful luminescent mineral that glowed a very distinct moonlight blue. Everywhere the captivated people looked, the mineral flowed throughout the planet like veins of life-bringing energy. Some of its properties, however, were very mysterious. Vibrating from the very molecules themselves was a nearly untraceable frequency that would take scientists years to decode. But a far more obvious and astonishing property held by the strange blue mineral was that it held a staggering amount of electricity, far enough for an entire civilization to thrive perpetually. They called it luminite, and it wasn't long before Arwin Rivers, a war-displaced refugee, gave a name to the world they all quickly began calling home: Lumen. But just as the prosperous life on Lumen the refugees had dreamt of seemed just within reach, the people were blindsided by a severe threat that quickly began to draw them uncomfortably close to a horrific and ultimate downfall. Lumen was a beautiful planet whose unique and picturesque landscape dropped many jaws. Mountains that seemed to spiral all the way to the heavens met with forests of over human-sized grass as black-trunked trees towered far above the tallest skyscrapers back on Earth. By growing up incredibly wealthy, Starbird had always bought his way through life, causing him to never get any real-world experience in complex operations. Although he, in his mind, thoroughly prepared to cultivate the new planet, a problem he never thought to prepare for rained upon his operations like a waterfall from the stars. Lumen, although no doubt Earth-like, was completely different from Earth. Instantly upon arrival, it became clear that growing crops, mining common materials such as metal, and creating new medicines was going to be far more difficult than he had expected, especially when there were 1,500 mouths to feed. Food supplies needed to be rationed, and with starvation imminent, anger towards Starbird began rapidly growing in the hearts of his fellow settlers. Starbird knew he was going to get through these tough times, but he had no idea how. Desperation began to suffocate, and with time quickly turning hostile, Starbird gathered the immensely overpaid scientists he refused to leave Earth without, and together they began to envision the very fundamentals of what would no doubt go on to become the greatest human creation of all time. It could change everything, and is 73.76428% possible. These infamous words by programmer Jeffrey Io are ultimately what convinced Starbird to make the wild, far-flung decision that filled most of his team with anger, arguing that it would end in complete disaster. Theoretically speaking, the spaceplane's digital life support system, which intelligently calculated how to best keep the crew alive during lengthy space travel, was so advanced that maybe, with a little reprogramming, it could intelligently understand the planet and calculate the best way to create resources. If it were connected to machines that could physically inspect the land, plant seeds, and cut crops, it should be able to autonomously produce enough food to feed everybody. And it would all be possible because of the luminite, which could power it endlessly. The problem was, it was going to require a ton of machines, but they didn't have enough materials to create them unless they totally salvaged their ship and just about every other computer and piece of metal that they had. Although he ran the risk of killing all the people who willfully embarked on this wild adventure with him, Starbird was willing to take the bet. In his eyes, no other option existed. Instantly, they began salvaging everything they possibly could to piece together the wild creation they called the Automated Resource Network, or ARN. Starvation had them by more than their throats, but on the morning of 82, they officially brought the ARN in wave for the first time. Instantly, the bold bet began to pay off. Even in its initial rudimentary phase, food production was far exceeding what the people themselves were capable of. Crops began to grow like wildflowers in the springtime, and it even began to mine metals at a staggering rate. The network was also smart enough to build its own machines. The people began to call them Autumns, and they were everywhere, autonomously flying around like intelligent drones, carrying out a variety of tasks. Starbird's favorite Autumn, the pilot, used its human-like arms to sow crops, while the flying lawnmower-like Harvester Autumn used large spinning blades on its side to cut them down. As this revolutionary life support system increasingly enhanced the lives of the civilians, it was becoming obvious that it had far more potential than anybody had initially assumed. But like all creations whose true power took time to comprehend, opposing views on how to use it began to slither its way into several very differing minds. For the first time in his 19 years of life, Starbird finally felt separated from the crushing expectations of a legacy that couldn't have felt more disconnected from a sense of purpose. Lumen, he knew, was where he belonged. While he took a lot of joy in exploring Lumen, he took even more joy in watching civilization grow, as it was the first time he'd ever really seen a happy and unified community. Everybody contributed their own unique talents to the greater good. Some made clothes, while others prepared the food that Arn harvested. Instead of working to obtain currency, they simply worked to survive, together. Although the people looked to Starbird as a leader, he was struggling to envision a societal structure that could nourish their tribal community into something far more prosperous and avoid the follies of earthen societies in the process. This made the thought of being seen as a leader highly uncomfortable to him, and he defaulted toward his natural tendency for procrastination. It wasn't until a deeply philosophical talk with Arwin Rivers that Starbird's loosely formed thoughts began to grow into something slightly more solid. Arwin grew up with bombs shaking all sense of stability out of his life. Constantly displaced from every home he ever had, Starbird's expedition gave life to Arwin's distant feelings of hope. He knew Lumen was full of opportunity, but worried about human habits dying hard. Starbird was highly captivated by Arwin's insights not only into human rights and civil structure, but just life in general. Insights which revealed a practical and compassionate heart. A bond quickly began to grow between the two, and Starbird began to see a task for Arwin that could highly benefit every single person who stepped foot on Lumen. They needed some kind of formal document that clearly defined the human rights that they would build their society on. It was the moment Arwin had always dreamed of, and he already had many well-developed thoughts. He quickly went on to create the Declaration of Rights, which revolutionized the freedom to individual expression by keeping laws and governance at a minimum. If only we had this on Earth, Arwin often thought, I probably would never have left. Forged from this vision of a new kind of civilization, Arwin suggested a name for the landing site they began to build into a town, a name that represented the very prosperity the Declaration of Rights created, New Dawn. New Dawn was a place where humans were free to be themselves. The town quickly began to take shape, but Starbird was flooded with the inspiration to reach even higher. Far more successful than he could have imagined, the Arn had an unimaginable amount of potential. Its ability to create and collect resources was so effective, Starbird wondered if it could soon take away most of the tasks that people contributed to the society. To Starbird and Arwin, this was an opportunity. Maybe it could allow people to spend their time doing whatever they wanted instead of the trivial soul-sucking tasks that were necessary to survive. Starbird had absolutely no idea how to make this dream a reality, but a fiery passion was burning inside of him, and he figured he'd somehow get there. Michael Trayburn had a very promising career back on Earth. Having worked hard for Starbird's father to rise through the ranks at the Weeble Forge Space Mining Corporation, Trayburn eventually became the head of security. It was his job to lead a small armed force and watch over the valuable space minerals once they returned to Earth. But for reasons Starbird had a hard time understanding, Trayburn seemed to happily set aside his seemingly great life and join the expedition as head of security and hunting. A job for which he was highly effective. While exploring the planet and hunting down the abundant creatures that often hunted them back, Trayburn harbored a strong respect with the small squadron of battle-experienced fighters he commanded. Lumen was full of nightmare-inducing creatures reminiscent of prehistoric Earth, and although the squadron was nearly slaughtered time after time, Trayburn consistently led them into another day of life and food. But they began to face a problem so complex that even Trayburn struggled to find a solution. They were rapidly running out of ammunition and struggled to discover an alternative to gunpowder. It wouldn't be long before they were completely out, and Trayburn was furious at Starbird for refusing to bring more. At first, tensions between the two weren't very high, but when Trayburn suggested they reprogram a team of Autumns to help seek and destroy several herds of the hellish creatures that could soon be a serious threat to New Dawn, he was surprised by Starbird's resistance, arguing that the Arn must remain peaceful. Trayburn didn't get it, and the shadow of a threat greater than any they already faced began to light its way into his mind. To Trayburn, Starbird was nowhere near the do-what-must-be-done leader that his father had always been. He was just the spoiled heir who funded the expedition. Although Starbird's vision of rebuilding an entirely new colony on Lumen never made much sense to Trayburn, he knew joining the expedition presented a unique opportunity that he couldn't pass up. Having worked directly for Starbird's father for many years, Trayburn was a big proponent in the very expectations that stripped Starbird from all sense of purpose that he already struggled to find, especially when they had just discovered something far more valuable than anything Earth had ever seen, Luminite. But perhaps far more valuable than the Luminite itself was the Arn, for which he also saw far more potential than it was being used for. He knew he had to do something about it. Day 204 on Lumen would no doubt go down in history as one of society's most significant turning points. As Starboard went for a mind-escaping walk through the contemplation-inducing spiral mountains, an unexpected message simulated its way into the smart contacts that overlay a smartphone-reminiscent digital world directly into his eyes. It was from Trayburn, who was inviting every single person to an emergency meeting at the raised luminite platform sitting directly in the center of New Dawn. Starboard felt a stab of nerve in the deepest parts of his stomach. "We are basically slaves," Trayburn started out with, a sentiment that no doubt caused ripples of shock. The people, he explained, had been working very hard, and for what? They're not even getting paid. Society, he argued, needed structure, needed currency, government, laws, and regulations. What they were doing was unsustainable. His eyes pierced towards Starboard and with all too true allegations, pointed out how many times he had foolishly marched to the people close to death. His playing with their lives was nothing more than distant dreaming, and it was going to end in disaster. They needed real leadership, and nobody could do it better than Trayburn. Starboard felt like laughing, but the nerve in his stomach began to slash as he noticed undercurrents of agreement. Heart racing, he knew it was time to unveil his biggest dreams yet for a society that pushed the boundaries of anything the people had previously known. But as he took the stand, his mind seemed to vacate. Perhaps it was the shock of his actions being questioned, but the golden vision he had for society just seemed blurry. "This is a new kind of society, one where we are free." His words came out all right, but when Trayburn responded with a simple how, his explanation cratered. Taking advantage of his folly, Trayburn proposed a vote to determine the future of civilization, and the voting began. Arwin counted as the people raised their favoring hands in a move that was yielding shockingly close results. As the clock neared zero, a few last-second deciders gave their final vote, and a grave realization began to sweep through Trayburn's confident and sturdy posture. But right as Starboard's stab of nerves welcomely began to ease, a horrific sight took hold. Out of nowhere, pilot Autumns, armed with hastily gathered bludgeoning weapons, began to swarm Trayburn and a squadron of loyal allies who rushed to his protection and withdrew their last remaining bits of ammunition. But the Autumns gave no stop. Bullets lined the gathering spot as the Autumns, along with several of Trayburn's men, were slaughtered into a fleshy pool of bullet-riddled silicone. Starboard was absolutely hysterical with surprise. Where did they come from? Were they defending me? Is it alive? As his mind flooded with questions, his ears filled with screams. Everywhere he looked, people had been caught in the crossfire. As nearly 100 bullet-riddled bodies lined the ground, his eyes locked into a face that burned with a fire unlike anything he'd ever seen. Trayburn had been attacked, and he so clearly knew who to blame. His fists automatically tried to take action, but his squadron held him back. For a second time, after firing several rounds of accusations towards Starboard, Trayburn asked the regathering and equally hysterical crowd for a revote. Overwhelmingly, a sea of hands raised above the field of distraught cries that damned Starboard into a new life as an outcast. In his first move as the new leader of society, Trayburn proclaimed that justice on Lumen began that day. His weaponless but adrenaline-fueled men grabbed Starboard and forcefully dragged him off into a life that Trayburn had yet to determine. The cuffs ravaged his skin as the blackened soil tore into his side, but as he was being dragged through the unpaved city streets, Starboard's focus was on his thoughts. Still in complete shock and unable to process the Arn's murderous actions, a strong sense of betrayal gripped him, and he felt as though his dreams had been stolen. But through all the chaos, one positive thought remained in his mind. Arwin will still fight for it. As he hopelessly tried to piece things together, a surprising bash ripped its way into his awareness. Splattered with what could only be brains, Starboard looked up to see several of his closest friends who were armed with the very bludgeoning weapons that initiated the mess. The sounds of shattering skulls heavied the air, and far quicker than he could have imagined, Starboard was once again a free man. His eyes rushed around in disbelief as the person who he figured would be the first to show up to his side was nowhere to be found. He looked into the sullen face of his friend and mentor Ravel and could instantly see a sadness that seemed impossible from the life-hardened man. Dripped with the blood of who knows who, Ravel confirmed Starboard's worst nightmare. Arwin Rivers, the man who had so desperately wanted to live a free life cleared from violence and danger, had been caught in the crossfire from Trayburn's men, but they didn't have time to grieve, as they were now fugitives. In a mad dash to improvise a plan, Lila Rosen, a botanist who had explored far more of the planet than anybody else, suggested they head towards the small research camp north of the Spiral Mountains known as Moonlight Ridge. The very plant-dense area was thick and rich in nutrients, making it the perfect place to hide. So together, in the cover of the 10-foot-tall monstera grass that lined the Spiral Mountains, the small, resourceless team were exiled into a mysterious landscape whose energy had an intriguing effect on anybody bold enough to venture there. Moonlight Ridge has a very strange energy. Dark, nearly black soil meets soft, electric green moss that sits in the shadows of building-sized plants towering above. It was hard to understand exactly what it was, but the exiles were quickly consumed by encompassing feelings that seemed far beyond comprehension. Surprising to them, however, the heavy blanket of energy was embracing and filled them with a sense of security. Lila was thrilled, as she knew the land had many secrets to be unveiled. Although deciphering its totally unique properties was going to be a challenge, she quickly got to work. Like the energy-producing luminite, many minerals, stones, plants, and creatures seemed to be graced with next-level abilities far unlike anything on Earth, some of which were very useful. Screechers, for example, were ferocious double-headed creatures that could easily rip and tear their unfortunate victim into uncountable pieces. With long, muscular, and athletic cheetah-like legs, the velociraptor-reminiscent creature became domesticated and rideable, allowing the team to adventure deeper and deeper into the luminite-lit plantland. His mind was filled to the brim with problems that seemed to stab like a serrated knife, but the death of Arwin / Starbird the deepest. Always questioning the nature of why things are the way they are, he began to wonder if Trayburn in charge was just what the universe wanted. No, he thought, it's what the people wanted, which is all that matters. Although his mind constantly worked to convince him of this, his heart spoke a different point of view. But its voice was quiet, and Starbird was able to repress it. After many long and contemplative rides deep into Moonlight Ridge, he began to simply move on from what had happened in New Dawn, realizing he had a good opportunity to simply restart and discover what else life on Lumen had for him. But late one night, as Starbird and Ravel sat marveling at the glowing blue waters of the Lunari River, a strikingly bright green flash radiated through the tall plants around them as an unfamiliar autumn revealed itself with uncanny haste. Instantly, an awareness of being caught by Trayburn filled Starbird's mind as an ambush seemed imminent. The autumn was unlike any he had ever seen. An obsidian-like flying eye with neon green wings that surged with a brilliant energy seemingly made from the clouds, the autumn clearly wasn't a part of the Arn. With incredible haste and agility, the small machine suddenly flew right up to Starbird's face. He jumped for cover, but it was too late. It had scanned his iris. Starbird was sure that death was to follow. Right as his eyes met with the heavy black rock that he may be able to bash it with, the autumn began to do something Starbird had never seen from an autumn before. It began to speak, and in a calming yet assuring voice, said, "I am part of the scribe system. Jeffrey Io has sent me to relay the truth to you. The Arn is not what it seems, and with me is the data that will prove it." Starbird was dumbfounded with curiosity, but there was something about this little flying autumn that seemed to melt away many of the equally heavy feelings of suspicion he fought to hold on to. After a moment of slight hesitation, his curiosity reigned. "Tell me everything," he said to the autumn. The large eye-like oval sitting between its high-tech wings became emissive, and a video began to play from its surface. "I've seen that thing before." Ravel was a man of honor who Starbird knew he could trust. It made his lack of suspicion all the more present. "Jeff and Arwin spent many days working on it, but I've got no clue what it does." Still highly skeptical, Starbird looked at the strange flying autumn and for the second time asked it what it was. "I am a part of an independent neural data chain called Scribe," the calm autumn replied. "To explain my purpose simply, I was made to verify the legitimacy of digital information and the identity of its origins. With me, digital information cannot be falsified. Normally, Starbird would think it's some kind of trap, but the system's place as a trustworthy way to fight deceit couldn't have come from anybody other than Arwin Rivers, whose late-night philosophy sessions dreamed of such things." With a sigh and a quick moment to prepare himself, Starbird asked to see the unsettling video the Autumn brought for what seemed like the fourth time. Once again turning into a screen, the Autumn's obsidian-like eye began to play a video dated the night before the coup. Trayburn and several of the men from his squadron arrived at the core, the hollowed-out mountain that was the home of the Arn's digital superbrain. Sitting on a raised platform overlooking every inch of the giant crystal-lined cavern, Jeff worked away. Trayburn calmly walked up and commanded his attention. "How do you program the Arn anyway?" he asked. Jeff, with a self-satisfied smirk, knew he created something great. "It's reached a point where I simply talk to it, and it programs itself," he said. But instead of responding with impression, Treyburn gave a quick nod to his squadron, who moved to choke off the entrance. Treyburn, now clearly brandishing one of the few armed guns on the planet, confidently demanded, "Make it so that from now on, it only responds to me." With a frightened expression built on true feelings of terror, Jeff glanced towards Pilot, and the faceless flying torso of a robotic masterpiece flew up to scan his iris. With a surprising lack of hesitance, Jeff gave the shaky nod of allowance that would instantly alter the entire hierarchy of the system. The pilot flew up to Treyburn and scanned his iris. He was now in control of the Arn. Disbanded from his feelings of distrust for the scribe, Starboard finally knew the truth behind why the Arn seemed to go rogue. And this psychopath is in control of society, he thought as his eyes scanned page after page of scribe data verifying the legitimacy of the video. Although only the Arn's data could prove if it had been reprogrammed for Treyburn's murderous publicity stunt, Scribe had calculated a probability from factors that itself had collected, and in this case, it was 98.7%. Starboard was shattered, but the Scribe wasn't finished and revealed yet another disturbing setback. Labeled a murderer, Starboard's name and reputation had been smeared by a completely fabricated accusation that blamed him for Arwin's death. He looked at the Scribe, who generated a probability rating for this horrendous lie. 0%. This thing has some serious potential, he thought of Arwin's great creation. He thanked the Scribe, and feeling far number than he could have imagined, hopped on his favorite screecher, Rip, and went deep into the dark soiled forest whose energy began to grip him. Finally, the people were his, and he was going to make them proud. Immediately after seizing control, Treyburn made the first big step in his plan for a prosperous civilization. While he promised the people currency and governments and overall typical city infrastructure, he didn't exactly mention how he intended to pay for it all. He aimed to mine the luminite and sell it on Earth. As his eyes glanced through incomprehensibly vast planetary scans of luminite deposits, he saw things far beyond just a prosperous civilization and knew he had to do whatever it took. His greatest challenge was rebuilding the spaceplane and discovering a rocket fuel alternative that would bring the valuable mineral back to Earth. But the easy part was already in motion. Immediately, Treyburn changed the very nature of the Arn. Crop fields were now abundant. Why should it be focused on that? So with an army of mining-focused autumns, he quickly began to extract massive amounts of luminite from the ground. His plans were well underway, and his goals were defined. It was time to announce his plans to the people. As soon as funds from the first round of luminite made its way back from Earth, he promised, society would boom. It shouldn't be long before his vision would brilliantly come to life. But first, they had some work to do. He issued a new digital fiat currency, valued alone by his promise of sold luminite, and together, Treyburn and the people happily began to work towards their vision of a prosperous world. As Starboard buried many feelings he was desperate to avoid, he rode deep into a luscious valley whose energy seemed to be calling to him. Accompanied by Lila, Starboard found himself overlooking a city-sized crevice that seemed to give escape to his troubled thoughts. But deep inside the crevice, living out her biggest passion, Lila was making a mind-altering discovery. A slit in a white stone cavern wall hardly big enough to squeeze into revealed one of Lumen's greatest wonders, Constellation Cave. Like a starry nebula forever encased in a great ceiling of deep white quartz, stones of every conceivable color refracted a unique light which entranced her with feelings that seemed to reflect the very colors of the stones themselves. Although simply seeing their beauty was an impactful experience by itself, Lila was shocked at what happened as soon as she touched one of the mysterious stones, and she knew she had to show Starboard. Lila, wearing rubber gloves and taking care not to touch it, handed a small rainbow-colored stone to Starboard. Instantly, an awareness for every single emotion that he even remotely felt was intensified by 10, causing an overwhelming and terror-induced experience. His anger could have turned him towards murder and his depression towards darkness. But these horrific feelings were confusingly countered with an equally overwhelming heart of awe and gratefulness. But of all the heavy emotions flooding through every inch of his soul, none of them was stronger than the one that he was so sure had been expelled from his heart: hope. Hope for the better world he knew the people truly wanted. His heart, far overtaking his brain for once, enlightened him with an understanding that had previously escaped him. They just have to see it first, he thought. For the first time since his exile, he knew he couldn't just give up on everything he had set out to do and watch it wither into history. He knew he had to try, and his new mineral-induced confidence was just the surge of motivation he needed to get there. Somewhere around 64 days of heavy mining, a once distant threat began to grow into a massive problem for Treyburn. Although he had discovered a very potential substitute for the rocket fuel needed to get back to Earth, refining it at scale was edging on impossible. Wicked and weird things were known to come from the branch impact crater, and this unique potential was no exception. His team, after much experimentation, discovered a small and quick crab-like creature whose fire-red shell growth stored energy that was photovoltaically captured by the sun. With a little refining, a powdered chemical produced from the growths was highly explosive and could be a perfect substitute for rocket fuel. But there wasn't many of the creatures, and catching them was highly difficult. To catch them, Anji, a data technician at the control of an orbiting satellite, would cast beams of infrared light down to the planet's surface. The Chargers, as they became known, would flock to the light like a horde of zombies chasing a meal, and pilot Autumns would swoop in to catch them. But this was very difficult, as some wavelengths of infrared light would trigger an explosion that would destroy the Chargers, while other wavelengths would cause a mini EMP that would fry the pilot's electronics. Anji, however, was a master at his craft and worked diligently to refine his process and catch more Chargers. Although they needed thousands to potentially make rocket fuel, Trayburn felt optimistic that Chargers were the solution, and he began breeding them on a massive scale. But with as much ground as this explosively curious solution was gaining, his mining operations were falling flat, as a whole warehouse of the very mineral his entire society relied on sat unshipped, causing Trayburn's promises of prosperity to seem distant. Worse yet, new refugee harboring ships from Earth had rapidly expanded Lumen's population, and resources once again began to dwindle. The Arn was so focused on mining that it couldn't produce enough food to accommodate so many new refugees, and they began to grow desperate. Although it couldn't seem to get any worse, the influx of people along with the unfulfilled promises of sold luminite caused Trayburn's currency to become dangerously worthless, creating an economy of struggle. Trayburn, however, knew that while the people were angry, they were still contained. And because he was very close to launching back to Earth, their sacrifice would soon be paying off. But Trayburn had to double down. Without hesitation, he redirected even more Autumns into mining and did everything he could to collect as many Chargers as possible. As he sat and twiddled with the rainbow-colored reflection stone that filled him with increasingly clear feelings, Starbird reflected upon the life he had back on Earth, a life that was the exact opposite of Arwin Rivers. His privileges were a mask that cloaked his need to survive, allowing him to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. He was free. And although he highly took it for granted, those were the happiest days of his life. Stabbing feelings of guilt consumed him as he truly saw for the first time why it was impossible for most people to live a similar life of ultimate free will. Leaders were always fighting for power and resources at the expense of everybody else. So what if nobody was in power, he wondered. What if the Arn took that need away? So advanced in mining and farming, Starbird knew it could masterfully do everything a good leader could do, like regulate an economy, uphold a system of law and order, and build necessary infrastructure, all, as always, 100% autonomously and unbiased. And if there were multiple human organizations watching over it, the people could ultimately keep its power in check, making it a leaderless, decentralized society. He called this system of governance Autumism, and he began pouring everything he could into creating a speech that meticulously detailed it. Days countlessly flooded by, and draft after draft came and went. But finally, after so much detail his speech could have lasted several days, Starbird's vision was ready to be unleashed. Exiled from society and completely banned from the online expedition database that was the planet's internet, unleashing his vision was going to be tough. But Starbird had a secret weapon. Alina, the woman who created the database, was a close friend who lived in exile with him. By taking advantage of the system's lack of verification requirements, they far too easily created a fake, intelligently generated profile of a war-torn refugee from Earth. Taking the name of his favorite conspiracy theorist back on Earth, Starbird, as far as the digital world was concerned, was now known as Travis Kreitzer, and Travis Kreitzer was going to change the world. It all started with what was no doubt the most historically important video Lumen had ever seen. On the evening of Year 2, Day 41, Travis, in a blankly staring, emotion-concealing mask, sent a video of him passionately explaining how possible a better life was to every single person on the planet. Because of the Arn, people wouldn't have to spend their lives working to survive. They could simply just do the things that were meaningful to them. It would be a new era, a golden age of humanity unlike any that has ever existed. His words profoundly struck the hearts of almost everybody who watched the video, which became immensely popular. A slightly below the surface simmer of discontent with Trayburn began to boil. Trayburn knew that this was a major threat and completely scrubbed the entire database of every remnant of the video. But it was too late, as the message couldn't be deleted from the people's hearts. Through every nook of society, whispers of yearns for this hypothetical world began to turn into shouts, and the people gathered to protest in favor of reprogramming the Arn. After several days of protests that were rapidly growing, Trayburn began to heavily consider reprogramming the Arn after all, but if he did, it wasn't going to be what people were expecting. Trayburn had always thought about what would happen if discontent in society continued to grow, but there were certain things he just didn't foresee. Just days away from launching the Luminite back to Earth, Trayburn knew his people would soon see his progress and would gain just the confidence they need to hold on a bit longer. But the people had a will of their own, and their true desires began to show. Arising from the shadows, a new kind of weapon built from the same charger growths that fueled the rocket allowed for the people to instantly fry the electronics of the atoms. This wrist-mounted, projectile-firing, energy-manipulating device was called a fryer, and it emboldened people who were able to take their protesting to the next level. Highly moved by Travis Kreitzer's video, a group of dedicated protesters rushed the mine at Lionheart Mountain, frying atoms and grinding the Luminite mining operations to a complete halt. Enraged, Trayburn felt highly threatened, and drastic thoughts of retribution captured his mind. It was just before the rising of the planet's brilliantly white sun that Trayburn called Jeff to meet him at the core. Jeff instantly sensed heavy feelings from Trayburn, who was asking for his thoughts on something. He needed to defend himself, but questioned the morality of his only option. But on that morning, despite heavy pleas from Jeff, Trayburn decided that he would do what must be done. He, with a guilt-laden hesitance that Jeff had never seen, reprogrammed the Arn to not only arrest dissenters, but to actively seek out all supporters of Atomism and arrest them. If anybody resisted arrest or threatened the Atom, it could take any means necessary to defend itself, and he upgraded them with next-level weapons and defense mechanisms. Not even Trayburn could have comprehended the effects of the change he'd just made. Many fought back with an intensity that hadn't yet been seen, but their efforts were useless against the Atoms, whose battle upgrades turned every act of protest into a slaughter. Through the fields of blood, the broken-into survival pods, the growing population at both the hastily constructed prison and the colony's only cemetery, Trayburn's message was clear, and the people began to comply with the order he was forcing upon them. Talk of Travis Kreitzer's video quickly died, along with the hopes of it ever coming to light. Starbird was disgusted. Trayburn's actions were a gross violation of Arwin's very fair yet lenient ethics laid out in the Declaration of Rights, which now seemed completely forgotten about. But beyond Trayburn's sickening actions, Starbird was most gutted over what had become of the Arn, a life-saving resource that he helped to create. Increasingly encouraged by the horror stories of the people he once had such a great relationship with, Starbird's guilt became inspiration, and he decided that it was time to take drastic measures of his own. Starbird knew that he, or rather Travis Kreitzer, had an incredible amount of influence over the people, and he knew just how to use it. His plan was going to be risky. It was going to be hard, potentially even suicidal, but Starbird knew that the people's belief in his vision was a far greater force than the army of war atoms that they faced, and so he got to work. He and his team made as many fryers as possible. They domesticated as many screechers as they could and built detonators that turned the few chargers they had into explosive charger nades. But the most valuable weapon that Starbird's team had wasn't just the potentially thousands of good people he knew would fight by his side, but the secret weapon he confidently knew would usher them into action: Scribe. Complete with the video and data proving that the Arn had been stolen the night before the coup, Starbird issued a call to action, inviting almost every single person on Lumen. Town center, 2 hours. We're taking back the Arn. He hit send but was instantly consumed by nerves. Things just got very real. His shaking hand slid into his pocket for a quick, reassuring embrace of the reflection stone. While strength and confidence filled his heart, Starbird kicked Rip into action, and they began to run full speed towards New Dawn. Starbird rode into New Dawn with nothing but a wave of confidence and a slight laugh as he tried to determine whether his now infamous mask or his real identity was a more guaranteed way to get killed. Quietly approaching the center of town, an alarming awareness began to creep within. Starbird was hauntingly alone, and it seemed as though nobody was coming to save New Dawn with him. His eyes met the raised Luminite platform sitting directly in the center of town, but as soon as a familiar energizing hum tickled his ear, he knew he wasn't going to be alone after all. Programmed with an allowance to kill, Starboard swiftly found himself swarmed by murderous pilots. Snarling and showing its several-inch-long dagger teeth from each head, Rip's long muscular legs bolted into action, quickly outpacing the Autumns as it leapt from boulder to building. But right as freedom was seemingly in grip, a heart-dropping sight unveiled itself to an uncomprehensive Starboard. A fleet of pilots, upgraded with nerve-inducing tools of war, had joined the chase, and with it, a mysterious new kind of weapon that Starboard would instantly meet. It was called an energy scepter, and in a lightning strike, nerve-jolting arc of an instant, Starboard was on the feelingless ground, condemned to a nearly complete paralysis. War pilots began to crowd his completely vegetative body, but his still strong confidence kept his eyes wide open. It wasn't until the slightly face-searing explosion that he shut them. In an electrically bright red flash far too close for comfort, a charge grenade blasted as thousands of pieces of shell and dust enveloped him like a whirlwind of raging water. As the suffocating dust began to settle, Starboard slowly recognized two familiar silhouettes, Lila and Ravel. But they weren't alone. Hundreds of fire-fueled eyes surrounded them, and it became clear that New Dawn was going to be reclaimed after all. But first, a fight for survival. Thoughts from regret to astonishment tormented Starboard as his fully incapacitated state left him with nothing to do but watch as a hurricane of flesh and metal stormed into a sea of destruction. After an agonizingly uncountable blood-soaked time, a piercing stab in Starboard's leg turned into an ability to hobble, and he rushed towards the platform that slightly overlooked the surrounding battle. It was quite the sight to see, but it's what he heard that really took him by surprise. Deafeningly loud, the people had taken notice of his rise to the platform and began chanting Kreutzer with as much volume as their voices would allow, completely overpowering Starboard's attempt at a speech. But the battle was ending, and he knew that time wouldn't favor their march on the core. So to get the people's attention, Starboard was forced into an action he promised to suppress. Right as the last few Autumns were bashed into the soil, he ripped his now famous identity-concealing mask free to reveal the murdering, dangerous man that Trayburn worked so hard to exile. His expectation was a roar of unity, but the reality was a complete stunned silence. Adrenaline, however, was rushing through his veins like a shadow-stalking assassin, and his voice automatically began shouting the only silly words that came to his mind. It's time for a new evolution. Screw Trayburn, screw mining, and screw it. Let's take back the Arn. He raised his fist, and a unified army of fierce warriors raised theirs back, ready to ignite the flames of rebirth. Starboard yanked an energy scepter from a heap of electronics that was once a pilot and began to lead the mob towards the core. It was growing somewhat dark, but the magnetic blue glow of the planet's Borealis-like Voltaic clouds lit the energized march towards the hollow tomb of a hill that had become the home of the Arn. Prepared for a stormy battle, the mob that Starboard had inspired was fierce, but as they reached the tunnel entrance, they realized Trayburn's army of war-ready Autumns might be far fiercer. No time was wasted, and deafening explosions from the charge grenades began to reverberate off the surrounding hills. Everywhere he looked, energy scepters incapacitated surprise-struck people as friars created heaps of useless Autumns. Starboard watched in horror as pilots began to flood the crowd with a bludgeoning attack, and the flying, lawnmower-like Harvester Autumn, now refit with ultimate killing upgrades, flanked the sides. Spinning blades twice the size of its crop-trimming relative sliced people in half as knife-edged protrusions grated them into mince. Showers of blood turned the mob of nearly 1,000 into a sea of deep red, but they were strong-willed and didn't even think of turning back. Riding on the back of Rip, a painful awareness began to nag at Starboard. This fight, he realized with a sobering awareness, was a losing battle. But his dreadful thoughts were cut short as an unnerving sight caught the corner of his eye. An Autumn was inches behind him, probably about to deal a fatal blow. He quickly turned around, but as his terror-filled eyes began to focus on the flying eye-like creation he had grown to revere, his fear evaporated. The Scribe Autumn, he thought, as its comforting voice began to sound. Jeffrey Io has entered a map of the core into my database and asked me to show you a point of interest. Do you wish to continue? Yes, Starboard screamed. A navigational arrow popped up in his contacts as a 100% verified fact box labeled Escape Tunnel simulated at the bottom corner. Kicking Rip into motion with a force that seemed to instantly bring him to the back of the hill, Starboard effortlessly found the hidden door that was perfectly highlighted in his eyes. A verified code granted him access to the fortified metal doors, and long before his eyes could adjust, he found himself in an incredibly long and dark tunnel that had an ominous blue glow awaiting him at the end. As Starboard silently walked through the tunnel with a nervous haste, a startling realization gripped him. He was not alone. His grip readied the energy scepter, but when its sights met an equally as startled face, a wave of relief swept through him. Jeff, he thought. Thank the universe. The Scry Bottom found you. We must take back what we created, Jeff said frantically. Starboard was thrilled to hear Jeff's words, but his enthusiasm quickly faded as Jeff informed him of the task's impossibilities. Without both obtaining a retina scan and performing a consciousness check to verify Treburn's consent, reprogramming the Arn would be impossible. Starboard refused to feel hopeless as his mind raced to find a solution. Vacant and hollow, his options seemed dismal. But there was one question that couldn't escape him. Why is he doing this? Although Jeff mostly responded in shrugs, he did give Starboard an interesting piece of information that seemed to open a planet of possibilities. He sure feels guilty about it, though. A smile crept through Starboard's shadow of frustration, and he silently stepped into the vast center of the core. Small blue crystals of luminite glowed like a starry night on the ceiling high above as the Arn-powering skyscraper-sized crystal descended hundreds of feet into the mountain below. At the very center of the cavern rose a control platform, and on it sat the man who seemed to have lost all sense of control. Treburn's distraught head was buried deep into his arms, probably to avoid the horrors taking place outside. Quiet as can be, Starboard crept up from behind and introduced him to the paralyzing jolt of the energy scepter. Like a body without a bone, Treburn melted to the floor, where he could do nothing but helplessly stare. Starboard walked up and began to play with his guilt. It's quite the bloodshed out there. Let me show you what it's like. He opened a large simulated screen in both of their contacts, but paused to take something out of his pocket, the reflection stone. He placed it on the barren and motionless hand, limply lying across Treburn's chest, and watched as his eyes became flooded with overwhelming emotions. Heavy thoughts of terror ripped from his mouth until they melted into a sea of tears. But so shortly after, a drought struck, and a longing yearn for dreams swept his gaze. It wasn't until his yearning became tainted with a frown that an emotion far heavier than any of the others began to take hold. Guilt, recognized Starboard. It was time. He began to show Treburn a slew of videos. Shot straight from Starboard's eye, Treburn watched in horror as the Arn turned many of his own friends into pools of blood-soaked flesh. Tormented but not yet disturbed, Starboard played increasingly horrific videos until the most desperate of pleas told Starboard that Treburn was at a snapping point. Starboard closed the horror-inducing screen and softly told Treburn that everything was going to be alright as long as he reprogrammed the Arn and relinquished control of it. Treburn's heavy tears met with an obliging nod as victory hormones began to flood Starboard's brain. But the words that came out of Treburn's mouth couldn't have been a greater stab to any of the feelings of hope that Starboard knew better than to feel. I swear it, I would, Treburn said as his tearful eyes burned with fear. But I am powerless. The Arn has taken control of itself. Starboard stood so shocked he didn't even notice the squad of pilots surrounding him until the jolting thud of suddenly coming face to face with the hard marble ground snapped him into reality. Charge grenades exploding just outside echoed through the main entrance tunnel as the starting realization that the Arn was autonomously causing this bloodshed injected him with a violent nausea. A rushing pilot grabbed his wrist so tight he could feel his hands fill with blood. The rough marble skinned his arm and thighs as he was dragged at an unimaginable pace. And although he wondered if it might all be over, the hurried pilot suddenly began to shake a violent death by electrocution. As it fell to the ground, Starboard was stunned to see that his savior was the last person he could have possibly imagined, Treburn, who was running toward a hidden exit so fast he could hardly look back to yell, "Follow me." Back out front, the course entrance was an even bloodier battlefield than before, further confirming this fight as unwinnable. But Treburn was on a mission. He dodged and jumped over attacking Autumns as his tunnel vision led him to a medium-sized, unmarked survival pod next to the core. The pod was full of questionable science experiments. While many seemed to be on the side of the wicked, others seemed to be more practical. But none were more interesting to Treburn in that moment than the very experiment that had been frustrating him for months. The chargers he was attempting to convert into rocket fuel. With a quick glance, a man following Treburn jumped into the nearby satellite operating chair, grabbed the joysticks, and prepared for battle. It was Anji, and he knew exactly how to help. Treburn opened a cage door and unleashed something that he knew would be incredibly difficult to replace. Hundreds upon hundreds of chargers who were now scurrying at the door, desperate to reach the satellite's infrared beam. Anji looked like he was playing a video game. As he guided the chargers directly into the heart of the core, Starboard laughed at how much fun he seemed to be having. But as soon as the energy-filled creatures entered the core, a problem became clear. The ceiling of the cavern was slightly too thick, and the signal became weak. Many curses rang from the control room, but Trayburn wasn't around to hear them, for he had already sprung into action. As he once again dodged and electrified autumn after autumn, Trayburn streamed the view directly from his contacts over to Anji, who was following his lead. He entered the core, reached down, and grabbed one of the skin-puncturing chargers, and with every bit of strength his well-built body could muster, threw it towards the cavern ceiling. It was a hole-in-one for Anji, who had his satellite beams aimed in just the right spot, with just the right incredibly finely tuned infrared wavelength to pierce through the thick ceiling and slightly touch the charger. With a final shriek, the charger exploded in a blinding red shockwave that showered massive boulders into the room below, opening a hole just large enough to create a direct line of sight between the mega-computer brain and the satellite high above. Anji guided the chargers to the CPU, where he unveiled yet another expertly tuned infrared wavelength that unleashed an electronic frying, electromagnetic pulse of a storm large enough to completely fry the entire ARN system, along with every single atom within a mile and a half. Across the battlefield, powerless atoms fell to the ground, and for the first time that day, the screams of battle graduated into heartfelt cheers of victory. Trayburn, however, had become legend. In the end, the thick stone ceiling rained heavily upon him, ushering him into his final gasps of life. But he wouldn't die a villain. After making himself into a person filled with regret, Trayburn died making amends for his mistakes, a move that forever solidified him as legendary. As Starboard stood upon the former control platform at the center of the core, the sun's white rays bathed through the now stained glass dome that served as an inspiring reminder of the dangers that society would continue to face. Being unmasked and once again revered by the people felt welcoming to Starboard, as he prepared to announce a plan that would squeeze many second-guessing gasps of fear from the crowd. Despite the way that ARN had maliciously reprogrammed itself beyond human control, he was fully prepared to bring it back online. Clearly, many people did not consent, but what he next announced began to open the possibility into their hearts. Like a highly intelligent leader, but without the power to really screw things up, the system was going to revolutionize humanity. But to make sure such tragic things would never happen again, new highly tested safety measures were to be implemented to keep the system thoroughly in check. SHIELD, a fully decentralized human organization, would scrutinize the ARN's adherence to the Declaration of Rights, and the system would integrate seamlessly with the scribe data chain to ensure the ARN and the entire digital side of civilization were built from a system of trust. Additionally, in a symbolic move of transparency, the core was to be transformed into a public museum and social space where the people could forever keep an eye on the system's inner workings. He knew winning the people's approval would be a hard sell. Maybe it was his passion, or perhaps his well-thought-out plan, but the people ultimately decided to give him their trust and blessing. He reached up to grab the switch that would bring the new system in wave, but right as he touched it, tears flooded Starbird's eyes, and he took a moment to introduce something that he had begun to see as a friend. Given a distinct and welcoming personality, the new system harbored an interpersonal connection with everybody who interacted with it. Its name was inspired by a kind soul who wanted nothing more than to have the world they were about to create, a world born from his very heart. Starboard initiated the sequence to bring the system to life as an inspiring and inviting logo spawned into the eyes of everybody standing in the warmly lit cavern. And in a soft and welcoming tone, perfectly balanced between the masculine and the feminine, a voice that the people would soon go on to call the greatest lifeline introduced itself to humanity for the very first time. I am Arwin, and I welcome you to a new evolution.